Malo Tiko, it's a bit echoey. Malole and good morning everyone. Greetings to you all. Timo te whai ha ki I lea ku o whiawhia piko ke taumo atoka I whawhetai me kura malo ki a kua mapi. I he ene tau he tau ma ui vai vai. Tau a o sia ai aho ko loko eni. I begin today with acknowledging the Ngunnawal Ngambri people who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we are gathering here today, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I extend that also to respect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are with us today, either in person or online, as well as the traditional custodians of those on the lands of which others we may be zooming in from as well. Welcome to the Department of Pacific Affairs Research Seminar. Today, I was tasked with introducing our presenter today, as well as chairing today's session. Sonia sends her apologies as she is teaching at the moment. And so I had 3 or 4 paragraphs to share about the amazing Salā Dr George Carter, but he has advised me to skip that and just to go straight into today's session. So I might just give a short version of that. Salā Dr George Carter is obviously known by many and is a colleague of ours and is a friend to us all, an enemy to none. Jokes. And if you're not friends with George, then you're missing out. But hopefully maybe after this, then there could be continued collaboration and friendship being made. Salā is half Samoan, Tuvaluan, Kiribati, Chinese, as well as British ancestry. And he serves his family, community, and village in Samoa, where he holds the Matai chiefly title, Salā. He's also a research fellow with DPA and is the current director of the EMU Pacific Institute. He also had made it known to me today that he just arrived last night from overseas and that he will also be flying out later on this afternoon. So we are very honored that you would avail your time for the less than 24 hours that you are in Australia to present to us your knowledge and expertise on negotiations concerning climate change at an international but also regional level as well. So without further ado, I would like to welcome everyone to let's give a round of applause for our research seminar presenter, Salā Dr George Carter.
Yeah, mo pat lo pat like pat na lo so ipunga langi ma pat na nga lo fai foina practice mai ngalai. I'd like to acknowledge traditional owners of this land and Ngambri and Ngunnawal people, but also indigenous peoples and communities who are also joining us online. And I'd also like to acknowledge dear Pacific friends and colleagues. I've mentioned to many people that when I do present, I'll make sure I'll let them know, because a lot of people who do follow and work within COP always ask to give a lecture, in terms of a training, an insight into what happens into COP. So October is the month that has been bestowed upon me to give my presentation here for our research seminar. And it's just fitting as we are now in COP mode for many of us who do follow COP. And so I'm using this to just give an update on where the research has been on climate diplomacy, the type of work that I do, but also gives an insight into COP, how to follow COP, but also to a little bit understanding on how Pacific states, which I started the project with, now has become also about Pacific peoples. While I started following how Pacific officials and leaders were involved in the space of climate change negotiations, I found that there's also another great world of working with NGOs, individuals from private sector who go to these COP. And like right now, I'm actually not overseas, I'm actually in Port Douglas, back and forth today because there's currently the Pacific Gathering of Indigenous Peoples from Australia, Aotearoa, and the Pacific. And thank you very much, PQ, for allowing me to participate in that program, working with Indigenous leaders in preparation for COP28. And so this is a work that's built from since 2015, working with the leaders and governments of Samoa, Niue, Papua New Guinea, and Australia. These are the governments which have supported and facilitated my participation in COP, working with NGO groups like Pacific 350, Climate Warriors, NGOs like PCAN, NGOs from across the Pacific who participate in these negotiations, but as well as universities. University of South Pacific and National University of Samoa. These research collaborations over the years have allowed me access to information, which helps sort of build this body of work around climate negotiations. And so I'll start with how I'm conducting this research. So giving you understanding, whereby it is about understanding inside COP negotiations, but I've used global Talanoa, and it's something which started with me when I was working on the PhD, and it continues on today. It's a mixed method type of approach that incorporates global political ethnography of these meetings at the international level, of these climate change meetings at the regional level within regional spaces, but even in local spaces, and understanding how these meetings and partnerships go back and forth, up and down. So it's a global political ethnography. I use Talanoa in terms of, part of the global Talanoa is that participant observation. So I become embedded both as a researcher, but as one of the participants. And that is made known clear in these meetings right from the beginning, whether I'm a representative because of SPRIP, or I participate because I'm a representative for Papua New Guinea, or I'm a representative, for an NGO. In this case, in the North right now, in the current Pacific Gathering, I'm attending as the Indigenous Peoples Organization, right? There's that official capacity that you're there. But everyone knows I am an ANU researcher at the same time. To clarify, so it's subjective all along in terms of the research, but that sort of dual participation in these meetings and gatherings allows that actors. I follow sort of practices and the process inside these meetings. At first, I'm looking at transactions of these exchanges of groups of ideas, exchanges of how people try to find a compromise or consensus in these. But over the years, I found that it's also about these relationships, how they've been built over the years, both cultural, but also professional. And that's something that I found even more intriguing as we've gone along, because yes, we can study in international relations that you can look at it in terms of strategy or rational behavior, but we also need to understand that the basis of a lot of this behavior of individuals, or we can look at them as states, are also based on relationships. They're not based on a blank slate. They also operate within a working relationship from years before. And that's something that IR has now opened its eyes to in the ideas of relationality. As we now, for those of us who follow IR, it's now such a big component of what we try to explore. And the use of Talanoa. And in this case, I'm not using Talanoa as a methodology, but as a method in terms of these, working with people who participate in these meetings, where they're able to share both their personal stories or professional stories. But I found now Talanoa is not only just for working with people from the Pacific, but also those who are not from the Pacific. You can have a Talanoa with a participant from Zimbabwe or a participant from India. There are the affinities that you can use as a researcher, which I found in working with using Talanoa with someone from Australia. It's very much possible. And that's why I use this sort of package of global Talanoa in this type of research. It started in 2014. At the naive time of when you're trying to find what your topic is for PhD, I had this grand view. I'm going to explore, international politics of, of Pacific Islands, Pacific states, and international politics. So I cheekily went to, I went to this SIDS conference in Samoa, and there was this panel of these leaders, and one of those cheeky PhDs, you'd like to ask that pinpointing question. And I asked, what do we do for international politics? And these were responses from these leaders, that there was a failure of traditional diplomacy, new brand of diplomacy. We need to establish new alliances. We need to be in sync with negotiators. At that time, I knew nothing about climate change negotiations. All I asked was, how do you engage in these politics? And so I took these quotes or responses from these leaders, because my question was, when can we become a UN Security Council member? And, those questions you love to ask us in the IR, and what needs to be done. But this was their response. It was nothing to do with Security Council. It was something a little bit deeper. And there was something that they were talking about that meant to them. And so I looked at all these responses and I thought, what's going on that's causing all of this? And most of us in this room know, we were also writing at that time of the new Pacific diplomacy. Something was happening. We want to know what that is. And we also want to know how they employ these new types of Pacific solidarity in multilateralism. And it just so happens that year was the year of the making of the Paris Agreement, right? So it fit all neatly for me that to explore this big question of states' behavior, international politics, let's follow a regime or negotiations that was happening in 2015, and that was the UNFCCC, right? The year 2015 was the year where they were about to negotiate a new protocol to replace the Kyoto. So it was a new sort of rules to replace an existing rules. And I found out UNFCCC, long, protracted, prolonged multilateral negotiations that gave me the venue, and it was something about the greatest challenge of our time, climate change. Oh, even more better, part of a venue. Then I found a process that by 2015, they needed to come up with a new, or try and find a new agreement. So it was just following that process of how not only Pacific countries, but all countries in the world try and find a consensus in agreement. And at the same time, all across the region, there were these calls through the Pacific Island Development Forum, the Tapotapotea Declaration, the Port Moresby Declaration. Countries were asking for urgent call on climate change. So what there was that's happening in that year, so that dual process of countries trying to complete the climate change negotiations, which now we call the Paris Agreement, and as well as regional calls for greater action. This set the tone for, and I make it a bit more simple in this picture, is I'm very fascinated first to understand how these 14 countries from the Pacific behave with each other, how they build solidarity, where they agree and disagree, and then how they engage with other small island developing states in terms of the politics of inter-islands, and not only just in climate change, but what extends from these discussions on climate change. And then, of course, how do they engage globally? So simple picture, but how do you do that? And so the design that came up in 2015 was follow a negotiating process. And here, for those, I know everyone in this room are well-versed, but this is the history of climate change negotiations. Started in 1992 when it was agreed to the text, until we had the protocol in 1997. Fast forward, 2015 is when I started researching this regime and the way Pacific countries engage. before that, my analysis is based on historical texts. Since 2015 to 2022, been attending most of these COPs or following COPs as they undertaken, but following Pacific countries. And so in 2015, they agreed on the Paris Agreement, which is what we have now. And yeah, that's it. And so it's unpacking this specific society that meets this. That's the idea that I've had in terms of why I go to COP, is follow this group. They are the ones who are pushing and making these ideas. And that throughout the and the focus of their work has been on not only on the areas of mitigation, adaptation, and the financing that is needed to support the countries in this case, but also now, as we've seen, is in terms of loss and damage. And that there are transactions and processes of diplomacy that these individuals or the society follow. And part of that is consensus building. The aim of participating in UNFCCC, if you look at it in a different sort of way, is you're there to try and find a global consensus every year. Some parties go in to accelerate consensus, to make very strong language, like what Pacific states normally do. Some countries go there to stall, to make it slow. And countries like oil-producing countries would like to make the decisions take time or add layers on top of it. So there are different ways and approaches in which parties participate in this. But also that it's not just about mitigation, adaptation, but around it, with the focus on economy, conversations around security, geopolitics, and diplomacy. And the last part that I've picked up and now fully engaged most of the work is in work around gender and the participation of women in these in negotiations. Now, I'm not a gender or an expert in women, but actually it's working with those who are the gender experts. But my research has been to provide how to operate or work within climate negotiations. And they are the ones who push the ideas, but we work in terms of strategy, in terms of how they can maximize their voice in these negotiations. And so a little bit of history on this in terms of, especially with Pacific Island countries' participation, is that they've been part of the regime since 1988, before the Global Treaty on Climate Change had come forth. They had come together in forming the group of the Alliance of Small Island States, and during that time of 1988 to 1992, had proactively worked or traveled around the world in terms of multiple conferences to try and elevate the need for a climate treaty. And so they've been participating in terms of pushing climate change, not only through UNFCCC as started in 1992, the UNGA, but as also within the UN Security Council in terms of the area of climate security. And their leadership has been in terms of working in these coalitions like Alliance of Small Island States, or AOSIS, through the least developing states or countries, or LDCs, and of course within the greater Global Southern Coalition, G77. And another feature of this history of Pacific States and UNFCCC have been their partnerships with international and regional NGOs. In 2018, at COP23, Fiji became the first country, not only from the Pacific, but from a sixth country, to hold the presidency, a co-presidency with Germany. And that was in the year where a lot of initiatives around agriculture, initiatives on the clearinghouse on mitigation was established, as well as initiatives around loss and damage. And it's important to note that work of Fiji in that year to what could be the Australia-Pacific COP later down the road, in terms of the types of initiatives, but also the type of ideas that can come forth from this region in terms of accelerating climate action. But also at the same time, that it's not just, we've seen this, not just officials or diplomats who have been part of the COP spaces, but we've seen an increasing participation of NGOs, activists, in all different sizes and forms. And I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end. So part of this has been their leadership in terms of agenda setting. The history of Pacific States participation, some say they were the first drafters of the Kyoto Protocol, the first ever draft of any sort of protocol to operationalize the UNFCCC negotiations were pushed forth by Pacific States. Others also look in terms of their agenda setting in what's considered has always been the first movers in nominating certain mechanisms or pushing forth creative or innovative ways to combat climate change. These are some of the strategies they've been employing. One of this has been the idea of special consideration. Now, in the early days of the negotiations on the Rio multilateral, the Rio summit, countries were able to push forth the idea that because they were small island developing states, I mean, that they were small states, were isolated with big vulnerability, that they should have special access, a special consideration. Now, at the time, it was agreed and they've been given that, but it has given them a special access into most facets of the UNFCCC, a special seat in terms of the bureau or the vice presidents. There's always a vice president from the Pacific that's part of decision making. They have special access in terms of funding, as we know that in terms of GCF, that there's because a country like Tuvalu with 12,000 has to compete with a country of China with more than 1 billion. So this idea of special consideration for SIDS allows that special privileges. But part of that was this idea of a constructive narrative. Some authors argue that While at one side, they want to portray this dilemma of portraying that they are resilient. Countries are resilient in terms of how they adapt or the mitigation measures that they put forth in terms of climate action. But they also portray on one side the vulnerability. And that is a constructive and a strategic way in terms of not only putting forth innovation and ideas, but as part of that agenda setting. Now, the history also tells us there have been always strategic collaborations or international partners, but they've mainly been with international groups, all right? And they've been with groups like Fields, which is an environmental law firm, with climate analytics. There have always been NGO or strategic partnerships with World Wildlife Fund, overseas groups. A trend that we're seeing now is they're now also engaging with more strategic partnerships with NGOs from within the region, which is something that was not seen in these earlier studies. And of course, that the role of these multi-delegation groups was to have climate speak as officials from the islands, and also diplomats at the time did not have the full scientific knowledge of climate change to support their positions, as well as legal. The idea or the strategic maneuvering of wording in terms of how to negotiate, but also the diplomatic strategies. And the diplomatic strategies here, I argue for, are the relational strategies, you know, which is different from. I'll come back to the relational towards the end. And part of this within the UNFCCC, as I've said, this image shows it's a parliament. It's a parliament of countries coming together. And for the history, as we've looked at it, Pacific countries have always been part of this coalition of the Alliance of Small Island States. All right, let me just remove this here. The basis and the work of the country's positions, the basis of the positions that countries put forth in the negotiations have always been around these two things, the science and the experience. If you look at the key texts or the positions which countries have always pushed for, it's always been revolved around the science and experience. There was a great cyclone that happened in Vanuatu this year, or we acknowledge that there was a typhoon that was in the Caribbean islands. It's never about the economy. And so the basis for many of the positions that the countries put forth is based around science and the experience that is of climate impacts. This is very important because this is always what has been sort of the fortitude on how not only Pacific but Caribbean countries negotiate. This idea around environmental integrity, pushing forth that extreme. And that's why it's always a natural collaborator with environmental NGOs or with universities because of that key position which these countries portray. Because the experience, as these are the images of Mahealani and the IPCC team, which, you know, try to put forth, translate IPCC into translatable language into terms of that everyone can understand. These are the slow onset events that the islands will see in the next 15 years, both strong stresses, but also extreme events. These, you know, they not only, these words or these texts or phrases not only start remarks by leaders or the positions which portray, but also the type of initiatives that you see much more of the attention where Pacific countries follow. You know, it's less when exploring the membership and the type of issues that they follow. There will be less that follow carbon markets and more following loss and damage, more following issues around areas around adaptation that focuses on how these funding can have a flow effect for communities. And again, the message here in terms of these two slides is that the positions that are pushed mainly by the countries in the negotiations are based on the science of climate impacts and on their experience from these impacts. But at the same time, it's important to acknowledge that these climate impacts, this is a table I always like to show, that there is a diversity of the islands. Although they argue together in terms of these positions around science and impact, science and, what's the other word? Experience. The diversity is different. And that is also something that's stressed within the details of their positions, is that a country like Papua New Guinea maybe has more impacts in terms of droughts, is different from a country like Tuvalu and Kiribati, where sea level rise is of higher priority in terms of the type of impacts, but also the type of initiatives that they follow and take within the negotiations. This also explains areas where there is discrepancy or divergence in views within the group, whereby Papua New Guinea may follow the area of forests and maybe pursue area of forests. But for countries like Kiribati and Tuvalu, which do not have rainforests, it becomes a non-issue. And with non-issues, they do not become the regional or country or regional position in these meetings, but rather issues that are countries take up on their own. So, as I've said earlier, this was the slide I was talking about. In 2015, there were two processes. One at the regional level, where we see Pacific Island Forum, the Pacific Island Development Forum, were working on declarations in terms of urgent calls for climate action, but also in that year, following the work of SPRED in terms of their training for negotiators to climate change. And in for the international level, the work of the process in making of the Paris Agreement, and the research followed what was inside COP. Two important lessons from that year in terms of that came through was the work of Tuvalu. Tuvalu in terms of pushing the United States on the final language of loss and damage. After affirming the support of G77 in October of that year, United States had tried to reach out to Tuvalu to have multiple bilaterals to work on a common language for loss and damage. At that time, the United States had to want to take off loss and damage from the Paris Agreement. What it ended up with was a late night agreement between the two countries that there will be the issue of loss and damage on the Paris Agreement, but nothing to do with compensation and funding. On the other flip side, you have Marshall Islands, and its work with, instead of finding its own way through, it collaborated with the European Union and countries like the United States to build a greater coalition. Instead of running away and sort of hiding from big countries, it collaborated with big countries. And it settled the language on 1.5. It's important because these are the two big markers of the Paris Agreement. Yes, we do have everything on mitigation, adaptation, but these were the two most controversial issues of 2015. And it's an involvement of these two states from the Pacific in terms of loss and damage, where we now have the opportunity for countries to discuss issues on loss and damage. And now we have the current negotiations on the funding for loss and damage, and the fact that we have a global goal on 1.5. Although the language there says that to keep within 1.5, it still goes a long way because it's a marker and it's a benchmark for calls on greater climate action. And that's, again, a contribution of countries like Marshall Islands. What also came out from the study was that there were about 350 participants from the Pacific who were negotiating in climate change. And they were all there. And instead of the idea that they were working within AOSIS, because that's what text that says that they work with AOSIS, we also acknowledged that during that year, countries were also now meeting as a Pacific. It was the first time that ad hoc, in a corner of a room, officials from the Pacific would meet at a corner. And one of those first ever pictures is this. And these were the preparatory meetings in Paris at UNESCO, the headquarters. It was the first time that previously in other meetings, in previous COP, they said they would just meet outside in a cafe and just share information. That's the gist of what it was before. And now, during 2015, they met in a corner and they say, let's try and have someone follow a stream and report back and see where we can work. In effect, that became the start of Pacific groups working together. So it became known as PSITs, because that's how the mechanism that was available to negotiators working within the UN headquarters in New York, and they brought forth this mechanism into negotiations. Now, as these other images sort of show, they had a meeting every second day just to inform each other of what was going on. And they had the ambassador try and organize and share this information. It's important here to know because this was the start of technical negotiators working within negotiations. Now, previously, there was, they had training in the Pacific, but there was no onus to have that operationalized in these meetings. And so at the end of 2015, after many different findings that explored in terms of how do you build consensus in climate change negotiation, one thing that came up from that was the idea of a core group, that there are a core group of individuals that come together, that either through individuals or through coalitions, and they all come from all facets, but they follow the issue right throughout the year. This was one of core findings from the research, and something that we've been talking a lot with officials, some in script and also within the forum, to share some of these ideas. What was seen in the research, what was sort of done better, or what can be improved in terms of their work. Over the years, again, also within the region, following climate change, within how it's discussed within regional politics in the Pacific, as well as following the work of climate change in regional organizations. That's the other second part of the body of work, but also in areas of security, how the research has been used by Australian and French militaries to convene discussions on how climate security can be thought about, or the roles of militaries in the spaces. The research has also been used, been also following how climate change is used within national security councils and committees, but also how the issue is discussed within UN security. This is another part of the research over the years after the PhD. But it has really gone back to COP, and this is sort of the new iteration of what that research now looks like. So earlier, it was following the countries in the negotiations. This time round, the countries had requested, how can we look in terms of better cohesion, coordination? And so the study has now followed by working with regional organization as SPRIP to assist in terms of ideas and work around how to build cohesion around negotiators, officials, civil society inside COP. And this opportunity came in terms of also through the support of DFAT to follow and work during negotiations, but also to support in the training leading up to. So it's become now a research and network brokerage, whereby it's following the interplay of politics and climate policy. So I started with COP21, but now we are up to 2020, 2021 to 2022. So again, embedded within the Secretariat Pacific Region Environmental Program, it supports one of the various 8 different thematic themes that follow negotiations. And we work collaboratively with organizations like PIF, SPC, PIDP, and the plus other UN agencies to help member countries in terms of their technical negotiators and also their leaders. And so, as I said, the work around gender and women, this is the group of negotiators. They are gender officials, they are climate gender officials from within the country. The role is to work with them to navigate the UNFCCC system so that they engage. The role that we provide, it does not, we do not speak, but only from the back end. So attending these negotiations through as a research advisor. And so what it is now becoming more embedded as we talk about these strategic partnerships is giving greater emphasis on legal scientific research especially on the diplomatic. Now, this is where I'll talk what that diplomatic strategy looks like. In terms of engagement in activities that brings in terms of culture, there's kava in terms of connection. There's the example of using rugby to have a discussion between leaders. The idea of, during these meetings or convening meetings, that we build some form of culture that aligns, that builds relationship between negotiators. But at the same time, it's also finding ways to build bridges between negotiators from the Pacific to negotiators in other countries in terms of how to build and open up conversations. It's at the countries come up with their, agree to what the final decision is, but that's where the part of that research is. In terms of climate leadership, of course, part of that, as I mentioned earlier, is those participation in procedural seats. In the other area, in terms of gender and social inclusion, well, we started our work last year in this area with women negotiators and also focal points on the ground. It is now extended this year, working now with youth. Currently, SPC and Pacific Island Forum are working in terms of while these youth groups continue to hold their independence, it's a way of collaborating and bringing them together to share the resources. Some youth groups attend COP just to be on BBC, Al Jazeera. They are there to amplify voices through that social media. Some NGOs are there to focus just on indigenous people's issues. Some youth groups are there to focus on youth in mitigation. There are different roles, and there's understanding that plethora of activities and focus that these groups come through, but at the same time providing a mechanism that they have to support or work with leaders. But at the same time, if there is an opportunity to have that in terms of participating in negotiations. So that's an area that's working on right now, but also this new opportunity of working with local community and indigenous peoples. And part of building Bulgaria, these strategic partnerships, I always speak ahead of is this reaching these relations, working with local grassroots indigenous communities, climate justice. Although it's not central priority within Pacific, the regional priorities of the countries, it is still fundamentally acknowledged as it's acknowledged as a fundamental part of the Pacific campaign to these negotiations. Intergenerational voices has become a big theme within a lot of Pacifica campaign. And part of this is built in terms of the side events that are put forth, that it's not just the leaders speaking on the panel, but there's youth. And this is something that it's not of our making, but of the making of people of Pacifica society who are part of these negotiations. But also understanding Pacifica personalities. There are celebrities from in the Pacific or influencers that have a very big role in these negotiations. Brianna Fruin is one of them. Anote Tong is another, and Kathy Jitna has a very big influence, who can sit on the same stage with Obama and share, and views and on climate action that needs to be done. These are some of the other areas inside these negotiations which come through in terms of the leadership from Pacific countries. And so to end up with, what does this COP strategy look like? One is this technical support. And this is where SPREP has led in terms of negotiator training since COP1 to now, the annual training for negotiators and the FaceTime support in COP. It is the major platform, and it's supported by partners like Australia and New Zealand. And before, while it focused on Bonn and COP negotiations, I've seen the evolution of it now, then the support now going into UNGA. They're now supporting them on national training in countries. They're now also training and supporting them as they go off to UN Security Council meetings. There's an annual the technical thematics that are happening every year. The groups every year, there are 8, but also include UN agencies. And these are images of current meetings at the moment. And this is a perfect image of the lady here from Pacific Island Forum, Melania, and supporting Pacific other negotiators in negotiations with United States and Zimbabwe. These are sort of an image where you can, where do you see it? These images help us build that. The second is in terms of the area of Pacific Pavilion. Maximizing Pacific voices in these spaces means also giving a voice not just for leaders and policymakers who attend these meetings, but also NGOs and civil society, a space where they can share and tell their spaces. Beyond that, the use of culture, culture activism through the arts. Many people who participate are not only presenting their island indigenous culture, but also people are also promoting the idea of climate opera, climate poetry. These are some of the various forms in which it's showcased. And of course, youth engagement and local community indigenous peoples feature prominently in these in the pavilion. And the last one is political champions. Thinking strategically that in meetings you will need leaders in the last very moment, proactively in the last 2 years. This idea, which is led by Pacific Island Forum Secretary, identifies 8 thematic areas which leaders. And this year, these are the leaders who will be presenting the Pacific in this initiative. And they help elevate not only their country, but also regional issues in this area. And this is a new and a space that's exciting. When it first started 2 years ago, it was hard to get a cabinet minister. Now you have prime ministers wanting to be this. And so this is a political challenge that will come through because of many would like to be in these spaces. But it also is to go back and think about reflecting on there was only a handful of leaders from the Pacific who were engaged in this space because of the ability to speak or know the language of climate speak. But over the years, as many have become adjusted, but or access to climate legal, diplomatic, but also scientific information, more and more leaders are now speaking in spaces. So those 3 keywords: consensus, coherence, and climate update. I like that word, but it's convenient. How has the research over the year, what can we see and what are the big, great themes coming out of it? So one, we're exploring consensus, how states build and reach consensus, how small states in a complex with larger states, how they influence large states and how large states influences them, vice versa. What I find here, it's all about transactional. And it's important to unpack this transactional behavior that states have interact with. And very much part of that. A second part of it, it's also important, and that came out from that 1 year study. But I also acknowledge the fact that there was something a little bit more that we need to tease out, and that was relationship. And that was where I found in the second area of coherence. When going deeper into studying one country for a group for a longer period of time, as they try and build consensus over time, repetition in terms of building processes, in terms of managing their expectations, they are able to build this coherence, and part of that are the relationships. And that's something that we've also, we all know this, but it's very much found in terms of these negotiations. And harnessing that relationship sees these countries, although they have differences, are able to still work together. But we're also now wanting to understand more of these relationships because other countries want to work with them. Countries from Africa would like to work with countries from the Pacific on climate issues. It's not just the Caribbean, and it's not just the Indian Ocean countries. The United States would like to know how to work with the Pacific in terms of these relationships, in terms of climate change. So that's where understanding coherence allows us to understand better relational consensus or relationality in climate change. And the last part that I feel like the research has really allowed not only myself, but also another area in which the research can go is convening. Convening discussions. I found that the research has been invited or been used by partners who are able to have that climate conversation, whether it be countries from outside the Pacific or institutions like military outside of the normal comfort zone, or within the Pacific as well, between NGO and states. I find academic research can help break that barrier in terms of framing the conversation, but we're also finding that there is a need for this type of research to inform how these initiatives can be implemented. And so a friend of mine goes, why are you doing climate health, climate security, climate finance? I said, I'm barely scratching the top. I'm not doing it in depth, but what they're asking for is convening the discussion. And so he said, that's a very big part of what that research is, to make sure that, these conversations keep going. And I'd like to also take this as a challenge in terms of the next stage of this research. So if there is the possibility of the Australia Pacific COP, that the research moves into that convening area. Not to say between countries, but into spaces that may need that type of research into understanding what can be done for bringing forth building relationships, but also building consensus and understanding relationality. So that's where I feel the research can continue. Like, I'm just don't go to COP to go to COP. We're going to COP with a purpose. You're providing research support for research partners, but the research is, because we always have to think about how does this come back to the research? And it's understanding consensus. How do we look at coherence, but also how can we work and think about convening? Not just at COP, but outside of COP. The other thing that some people would say this researcher, I'm a COP cheerleader. I'm a hype man. I like to push people and make people excited about COP. But it's very important because although the fact that many say nothing comes out of it, no big achievements come out of it. But it's one of the best platforms that we have as a global society And so part of that is going out, informing what COP is, what it looks like, what it feels like, what it smells like, and then, finding your way through the different processes. And to do that, I'll end with this last video, which it's shows a little bit into the world of COP from the Pacific. Now, this was recorded from last year's COP27. It showed glimpses of inside what happens inside this COP. But while it's great to give you pictures and words and descriptions, I think this image, this video speaks a lot.
Sure.
It's been 2 weeks of intense work for everyone at COP27. So let's take a look back at our time here in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt.
Sorry, let me just go back and talk a little bit about the video. Now, this video is part of the support that SPRIP did, but it was a group of people, documentary, and they were filming documentary, and they filmed the footage of what was happening in the full 2 weeks in the negotiations. And they said to SPRIP, we'd like to give you this and show this is what we saw, right? And so they also made interviews with a few key people. But part of this, you'll be able to see one, the negotiators, the technical negotiators. There'll be mention about technical negotiators and the negotiating rooms. Two, they'll be talking about the pavilion, and you'll be seeing the types of activities that are in side events that are shared. And the third one is leaders, how political leaders have a role in these negotiations. And hopefully, what it is, it breaks the myth of, and you're able to see what happens inside COP. So sorry about that. Start again.
It's been 2 weeks of intense work for everyone at COP27. So let's take a look back at our time here in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. Week 2 saw our Pacific leaders push even harder to secure the Paris 1.5 goal, with the Pacific and allies from around the world pushing for the phase-out of all fossil fuels to be included in the cover text. That's a fight that continues into next year. Negotiations went into overtime into the early hours of Sunday morning, with our negotiators successfully securing a loss and damage finance facility. A huge win after nearly 30 years of fighting. Our leaders have also been meeting all week, coordinating the region's efforts and locking in support from international partners on the upcoming ICJ vote and the proposed fossil fuel treaty. As you can imagine, it's been a hard slog for the Pacific here, but as is typical of our people, we found moments of joy and solidarity, and of course, a mandatory visit to the sites. Our pavilion team has been hard at work hosting side events, showcasing the realities of climate change in the Pacific, and facilitating discussions that have inspired delegates here at COP27.
If we're not here, we're not at the table, and if we're not at the table, we're not being heard.
Setting the agenda and control.
Offers. We provide opportunities for side events to be able to share the different stories of our people.
Over at the Pacific Delegation Office, our delegates have been able to meet and strategize, a crucial space for us now as negotiations go down to the wire.
They have been coordinating, strategizing, meeting. It's an office that's been used for high-level bilaterals, ministers, briefings. All of those activities uplift the negotiators, and SPRIP looks after that office and manages that.
With all these initiatives, we at SPRIP hope to support and serve our countries to the best of our abilities. And we hope that in the coming years that we continue to up our support to our countries as we go forward.
Countries have now finalized the COP27 outcomes, and although there's still a long way to go to meet the Paris climate goals, the Pacific will be back in force in 2023 to keep fighting the good fight. For now though, it's time to return home to our loved ones and refresh for the year ahead. For Voyager Pacific, I'm Tunai Matia Jacob Netzler, and from all of us here, we wish you safe travels home, and we'll see you in Dubai next year.
Yeah, and that's it. That's our presentation. Hopefully that visual gives you an understanding of why we travel too much.
Dr. George, for that informative presentation. I certainly learned so much just in that one presentation. For the last remaining 20 minutes or so, it's open for Q&A. For those of us, maybe we'll start off for any questions or comments that anyone in this room might have. While we wait for those online who might have a question, just post it up on the chat for those of you online. But for us in the room, is there any questions or comments that anyone would like to pose for George? Yeah. And also, just maybe speak up, well, if not George, I have to repeat it for those who are online.
Just a quick question. I probably missed when you were speaking about it earlier. I was wondering if you could elaborate on the transactional behavior of states that led to sort of that first round of findings that you
Yeah. So transactional looks at the behavior around the procedures. So in terms of the strategies, in terms of following the procedure and following the process of UNFCCC meetings. So for example, the first 3 days are always set aside for prior to the beginning. Okay, start again. So the procedural focuses on the process of the meeting. So for example, before a COP, there's also always the pre-meeting days for AOSIS, for G77. And the behavior of states in there is in terms of finding strategies to coordinate amongst each other, finding those key big positions. And then the meetings then move into the leader segment, and then it moves into sort of the first week of SBI. You'll find that it moves from working within the coalitions, working within around key lead coordinators. You find there's more emphasis in terms of the strategy that's given into making sure the coordinators have all the information or have all the key positions. That's the main support. However, when it moves into the third week, which then starts off COP, which is the last week, it moves into a country position. You'll find that the coalitions have a less of a role, and the strategies for countries change. You'll find that you'll have the lead negotiators from countries coming to have an active role. You'll find the movements of countries looking for where are their ministers to help start preparing their work in terms of those negotiations. So that's what I mean about the transactional strategies and the behavior of countries based on the procedures. There's also, you can look at it in terms of the norms, the transaction in terms of the norms. But these studies or the previous studies don't really unpack the cognitive the relationship that goes behind it. Because negotiators don't go into the room and just are like frozen. They have a relationship outside, and majority of the negotiations is done outside of the room. The positions are agreed because when they are in the negotiating table, they are actually retelling or reiterating their disagreements. They're not agreeing, they're not saying their agreements, they're saying their disagreements. And so what happens in these meetings, the chair will then say, let's have a break and see if we can find common language. The process of finding that common language is the real negotiations, which you see officials moving around in the room to try and find it. And that's the relational that it's not necessarily captured in a lot of the research. And so we're trying to unpack and tell that as something of, yeah, what we're looking at.
George, that's really interesting research. I think the value that you demonstrate here is the longitudinal perspective you have, then tracking these things over multiple COPs. So related to that and related to this question of relationality, what happens, focusing on states here, what happens when there is these new governments, right? When the Rattler comes in, when the Gownie comes in, when the Brad Booker comes in, do the negotiators stay the same, or does the civil service change? The new people come in. Do you feel like you then have to start from square one again and update these people, or are you finding that the people are remaining the same and this helps for negotiation?
Yeah. Each country have their own are different and have their own sort of rules. I find that most of the negotiators remain there, even if they change of government. Perfect example is change of government still the same. But it's when they are utilized by governments into political positions, like they become ambassadors. So there are cases where, although the person is a lead negotiator, they became ambassador to Indonesia. So they get pulled out of the system, or they've been given a promotion to become ambassador to New York. They get a different they're pulled out of the system. But there's a lot of issues around retention, whereby very good negotiators are actually absorbed within the regional organizations. They take them on because they're really good. And this also happens a lot with great negotiators from around the world that get absorbed into the UNFCCC system. They get taken out of their countries, not just in the Pacific, but all around the world. They get taken out of Bolivia and they're put into GCF, and they lose that because they can't come back. And so there's a lot of that. So there's always a lot of training and retraining and informing new people to come through. And that's something that also weighs heavily, not only for countries, but even organizations like SPRIP and PIF who are thinking in these roles. How do you maintain some of that knowledge? But there's always movement.
Awesome. George, thank you. I really enjoyed that. And that's a lot. I'm interested in the role of the gender advocates. And I'm wondering if you can reflect on the extent to which their efforts and voices are being mainstreamed.
Yeah. So the experience here is based on Pacific only for the last 2 years. So that's when gender negotiators have been, gender has become prioritized in the regional, but also within the group. Not to say that hasn't been, but as a key one. We're told that we are too strong because they're already mobilized as gender officials. There's already a mechanism within the Pacific, and they already know each other, and they can bring in feminist groups, they can bring in all types of groups to the extra campaign as well. So they're well established, but it's knowing which part of UNFCCC or which part of the meeting to speak and what to speak and what don't worry we need to worry about. is where that work comes from. Are there voices being heard within the gender group? Yes. Within the wider mainstreaming, not so, yes, they are, but there's a lot more work that needs to be done. In fact, this year, one of the big push from colleagues was that we need to make sure we have gender mainstreaming across negotiators from the Pacific. So when we had training previously in Samoa, we actually try to provide gender mainstream training for negotiators so that they understand, even understanding language in terms of gender terms. So it's a growing, it's a need. Work has been done around it, but there can definitely be more.
Yes, thank you, George, for your presentation. I really found the framework of the figures I just want to ask a question about something you mentioned very briefly, which is about the typhoon in Vanuatu earlier this year. You said it's never about the economy. Just wanted to ask more about that example of what kind of strategy you were using for that. That or what you were explaining, just say what that was.
Sorry, you mean the science?
Yeah, when you're talking about science and experience.
Yes.
And yeah, and you mentioned in Vanuatu earlier this year, like this idea of like it's never about the economy. Are we using that as an example of experience?
Yes. I think I would go back and maybe reframe my words. It's not always about the economy. Yes, it is about the economy. But the arguments for, in terms of finance to support, yes, it's definitely a priority, but it's definitely not the only. It's also about the experience of the factor of climate change impacts. That's
so to clarify. I see it. And were you using that like in terms of the negotiations to make the point, or was
yes.
it okay?
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the key text, it's always, the text from the uses of Pacific, it's always acknowledging the fact that there has been a big disaster. There has been an impact on one's island or another country, acknowledging that.
There are no questions from online Zoomers, so I guess we'll have maybe 2 more questions from the other room. Then questions and comments that you have this next.
Hey, George, great presentation. Can I ask, just speaking of some comments you said about sort of secretariat kind of picks up people and takes them into the secretariat. Do you think the secretariat could do any more work to sort of support some of that convening power that you talked about? Like a lot of it is about relationships. Do you think, you've been in the process for a while, do you think the secretariat does a good job to foster those connections? Do you think they create an environment for parties, non-parties to come together and have these conversations, or could they do more? What are the suggestions you might make to them?
Yeah, I don't think we both know within Jen, I think they do try. But I don't think even in the mitigation work program or Lord help us in the loss and damage program, they have a focus on so I don't think the Secretariat does a lot of that. And I think they only do that only for the key negotiators, for the the lead negotiators from the coalitions that come to, or those who come for the workshops. I think there is on that. But of course, how do you do that with 198 countries? That's something. But what I'm saying here is that within the Pacific, because of this small group that has this program throughout the whole year of meaningful, they're able to build that relationship overall. Yeah. What can be done? Oh, love to sit down and explore some. I think there's a lot of opportunity, but yeah, but at the same time, I think I've started to hear from others that the work program from negotiations can also be quite a bit too much, and the reality is a lot of negotiators from the Pacific, this is not their first priority of work. Their first priority of work is actually implementing policies that they're supposed to. They're not just negotiators. So this mechanism that's provided for, that's supported by SPRIP and the other regional agencies is a big help for member countries to prepare for. But it's also very much conscious on the minds not to have a very big program, or else you leave members frustrated. The online has really helped and allowed many negotiators to be informed. Because of COVID, and now everyone is now online, able to work online from all the member countries. There's been more communication as well, where before it was very much dependent on the email system, or flying them to Fiji or flying them to Samoa to have the workshop once a year. But now with online meetings, there's been more and more of communication from the business.
Thank you, George, for sharing the very interesting journey for you with COPs. I heard very loud and clear that COP is not just about adaptation and mitigation. And I just want to build on that and ask you a question about Australia's bid to policy in 2031. How do you visualize that in terms of the Pacific being part of it? Yeah.
I think it will be and I'm resonating here what I believe or what I observe as feelings from negotiators or officials who are in those discussions, and they're very much looking forward to the opportunity. It's an opportunity to actually showcase also some of the initiatives that has come through from the Pacific, but also to push for vulnerability, where there are still gaps from within the Pacific. I'm very much looking forward to how partnerships from Australia and New Zealand, Australia and the Pacific and New Zealand, can be scaled up to other parts of the world, or informing or bringing in other parts of the world to greater climate action. What that would look like is something worthy of studying what that is, and sort of bringing up. But there are a lot of great stories and great initiatives that we see between Australia and the Pacific. And even now, when we're discussing this with indigenous First Nations, there's a lot of great work. Someone was talking about initiatives on blue carbon. They're looking at reef markets. I was listening to some of the ideas, although many are underdeveloped. These are some things that we also share in the Pacific, and so it's by having that that light on Australia and the Pacific and what their work is and their contributions. I think there's a lot to look forward to.
Sorry, I asked that question because we've seen how the momentum has been built from previous COPs to elevating our provide of this Pacific on the core international stage, and then bringing it back to Australia. Would you see that as an opportunity for the Pacific, but of course the rest of the world to really showcase what it is that climate impacts? Thanks.
It's just on this idea of that consensus which you talked a lot about, and how some states use tactics to slow or speed up consensus in negotiations. And I know in other UN processes, they go on majority voting rather than consensus. So just wondered if you could comment on what some of the strengths and challenges of the consensus are, and whether you would see a majority voting thing in climate negotiations ever work.
Yeah.
And
I really do hope there's no voting, because if there is voting, that's not a consensus. But consensus, just to, I mean, I didn't really talk about it here. I mean, just to go a little bit, consensus is not agreement. The study of consensus and looking at this by following specific states, it's actually when you agree not to disagree. You're not agreeing, you're just taking away your disagreement. So it's finding a way to find ways that a country or a partner can no longer disagree with the decision. They can just live with what it is. That's the very basic, and that's why we also have that call by people that it's not as, it doesn't have teeth. It doesn't, because what it is, you're trying to first, with multiple partners, you're trying to find ways to remove the disagreements so that partners or countries, delegates can live with that decision. Understanding that sort of main concept, you build strategies or ways into removing those differences. And for many of those, removing those differences is, I mean, those differences that people try to bring into is to slow it down or to move it up. So if they try to slow it down, we also try to find ways to move it around. So if they say, oh, why don't we do this in 5 years' time? Like, oh yeah, no, I think we can do that in 5 years' time, but let's do an urgent one now. And then we can do your 5 years time. So it's also working within that. And then it's like, okay, but you still agree to my 5 years. Okay, let me see if we can find something now. So it's always having a way to, it's not about the agreement, it's more the disagreement.
Just building on the value of regionalism, George, and I'm sorry, I need to pull it back to the impacts to the Pacific, but how does this reflect the voices of those territories? Countries were not represented fully as political entities. How are they represented?
So in the official delegations, they're not. For Tokelau, they're represented through New Zealand. And for the French territories, they work through under the French. However, they do come through in terms of the local community, indigenous people. There are organizations from Tahiti, French Polynesia, Wallis Futuna, who participate, and they are part of the Pacific Pavilion, where they have their events there as well. And so there is that informal, and this is where I said, like, these strategic partnerships that the countries are working on right now is opening, but not to a point where you formalize it, so that you also maintain and keep the independence of the different groups. That there's an understanding to work with governments that have an open line of communication, which they would like in terms of negotiations, but they also want to keep the independence that they're able to say and speak on the issues on climate justice. And there are also officials who do want that independence voice to go through, because politically they may not be able to say it, but through the NGOs, they're able to do it. So it's understanding that nature of working together, but also keeping independence.
And that brings us to our close. I believe it's now under very little question. But we're now leaving George to rest, because I'm sure that he's got so much to do now whilst he's here for a few more hours. And
You make me sound like the shift today.
So, Mama before George.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.